Hi guys, and welcome back to the Early Bird Photo News. In last week's episode, I had just come back from a few days in the outback photographing the rare golden-shouldered parrots, and then I had 2 days to prepare for the BirdLife Photography Conference here at the Gold Coast, and it was an awesome event. I gave 2 talks and I was able to connect with so many of you face to face, and I hope there will be more opportunities like this because it's always nice to see people in person rather than just reading names in the comments. So hopefully we can have more events like that in the future. But let's jump right into the hot topic of the week, the announcement of the Canon R7 and R10. I'll be mainly talking about the R7 because I feel like for most bird and wildlife photographers that will be the more interesting camera, and the R10 is really only interesting if you want a small camera and you're on a very small budget. So I'll be mainly talking about the R7 on this channel. Now that we've seen all the specs for the R7, I must say that I'm quite positively surprised, but also disappointed at the same time. It seems to be a better than expected video camera and a slightly, let's say, different than expected photo camera. Overall, I must say that it's quite an interesting and intriguing camera, and I think we should look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. What amazed me, if not shocked me, is that Canon put the R3 or very similar IF system to the R3 in the R7 and even the R10. So now 2 relatively cheap cameras sub $2,000 and sub $1,000 will actually have class-leading autofocus systems out of a $6,000 camera. Actually better and more customizable systems than we currently have in the R5 and the R6. So that was truly amazing for me, and I expect very, very good performance out of both of these cameras when it comes to the autofocus. And it's just truly unrivaled in the market, really. There's no camera that sits that low in the market that has class-leading autofocus performance. So that is great to see and something to truly get excited about, especially if you're coming from a DSLR camera like a 90D. Using an R7 with this amazing eye autofocus system will just blow your mind, and you will wonder why you've been using a DSLR for so long. On top of that, we have great autofocus not only in photo mode, but also eye tracking in video mode and bird's eye tracking. And this is something, for instance, the Sony i1 doesn't even have. Personally, this camera makes the most sense for me when I look at it like an entry-level camera into the mirrorless market for people who are currently wildlife shooters that are using Canon, Nikon or Sony, that might use a 90D or M50 or an M6 Mark II, and that want to step up into the true mirrorless market with the better RF glass and get great performance there. I honestly thought personally this camera could be a great second body to an R5 or an R6, but the ergonomics and some of the features make this much harder to be a second body. So I think when we look at it from the perspective that it's a great entry-level starting camera into the mirrorless world, this camera makes the most sense and the features actually look quite amazing then. When it comes to the sensor, Canon is saying that it's a new sensor, or I would say at least an improved 90D sensor. At the very least, it should have better ISO performance than a 90D, for instance. How this will translate into the field and how it performs at those crucial high ISOs, we still have to see, but fingers crossed that we will get actually some good performance with that improved sensor and that Digic X chip that should give us great performance. Because we really need high ISO capabilities with this camera, because a lot of lenses people will be using with this camera will be an RF 100-400 that's wide open at f8, an RF 100-500 that's wide open at f7.1, and the f11 600 and 800mm lenses. And all these lenses need high ISO capabilities. So the amazing part is that if you put this camera on an RF 800mm lens, you will be able to shoot at 1280mm effective focal length in a tiny, very handholdable package. And once you take those great images, it's important that you also learn how to edit them. And for that, I would highly recommend that you check out my PROSETS and Masterclass down in the description. With my PROSETS, I enable you with just one click to get your RAW files to a perfect starting point. And in my Masterclass, I teach you step by step all the necessary tools and things you need to learn about image editing that will allow you to make your own images look amazing. I was also happy to see that the R7 will have IBIS, in-body image stabilization, because in combination with the image stabilization in the lens, you should have very stable conditions, nice and stable viewfinders, and you will be able to hold relatively low shutter speeds. And I think you will also be able to do handheld video even with some of these longer lenses, so that should be very good. When it comes to the speed, both of these cameras, the R7 and the R10, are truly amazing. In mechanical shutter mode, they're actually faster than the R3. What that tells me at the same time though is that Canon really wants you to use the mechanical shutter and probably only use the electronic shutter sparingly. Because from all what we've seen so far, the 30 frames per second in electronic mode are great, but there definitely seems to be a fair bit of rolling shutter. Some of these soccer images we've seen in some of the videos, for instance, had a quite sort of elongated ball rather than a round ball, indicating that there should be a fair bit of rolling shutter in these images. And I've read somewhere that it will be very similar to what the EOS R had, and that wasn't exactly great. So I wouldn't expect miracles from the electronic shutter, and it seems like it will be something that should be mainly used when you really need that speed, but not as your go-to mode like you would do on an R3, for instance. Let's talk about the buffer, because on a high-speed action camera, the buffer is very important, and this is where it seems to get a little bit tricky on the R7. We seem to be able to get 60 to 100 photos in C RAW mode, but only 30 to 40 images in full RAW mode. So this will definitely lead to issues in the field, because we're shooting at 30 frames per second. We literally only have 1 second of photos to take before we hit the buffer. And if we're shooting in mechanical, we probably have 1 to 2 seconds of photos to take. And the real issue is that we have 2 sets of SD cards in the R7, which means that it will take 8 to probably 15 seconds for the whole buffer to clear and before you can fully shoot again. So this is something to be mindful of, and that's something that I will definitely try out when I'm using this camera, but I already expect that I will run into issues in the field, because just 1 second or 2 seconds of shooting before you hit the buffer is not really something that I will enjoy. So hopefully it's not too bad, but that definitely seems like a big bottleneck on the camera. What I love is that Canon also introduced the Pro Capture from Olympus that Nikon now has, and the R7 now has as well, that allows you to pre-record a few images before you actually take the shutter button. So if you're someone who just always misses the action, you might actually get all the images now. And the best part about it, it seems to be available in RAW mode, unlike on the Z9, for instance, where it's only available in JPEG mode. So on the R7, you will be able to pre-record half a second of images before you actually fully press the shutter button, and hopefully never miss that crucial moment again. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that's the new layout and design of the R7. Personally, I don't really understand why you need to change a winning setup. The R3 is by far the best camera that I've ever used, with the perfect design, perfect button in the right places, closely followed by the R5 and then the R6 that also have the buttons in all the right places. One wheel at the top, one ISO wheel at the back, and then one wheel in the back that I usually use for the shutter speed. So having these 3 wheels is the perfect setup for camera, because you don't need to press any other buttons in the field. You can quickly wheel, change your settings, no problem. All of this is not as easily possible on the R7 anymore, and I think it will give me some trouble in the field. Previously, we talked about that I think the R7 is actually more of an entry-level camera into the mirrorless market, rather than a second body to an R5, and this actually proves this point, I think, because when we have multiple cameras, like me, 2 R5s and an R3, I usually like it if the cameras are very similar to use, because your hands just get used to using a camera a certain way. So if you now have a body that's completely 100% different to your other cameras, it will actually be a little bit more difficult to use in the field. So if you're starting out in the mirrorless world, it doesn't really matter for you, but if you're used to a lot of R5, R6, R3, this camera will actually be harder for you to use, and that would probably be my biggest complaint. I don't really see much of a benefit of changing the system, but a big drawback for people that are used to the old style that actually works really well. Of course, it's great to see innovation. I'm not opposed to having a wheel around the joystick. What I really don't like is having that D-pad with the switches in the back rather another wheel. So if it had that joystick with the wheel around it at the top and then another wheel at the bottom, I probably wouldn't have as much of a problem with it because I would still have 3 wheels, one for aperture, one for ISO, one for shutter speed. But only having 2 wheels and then having to press some sort of button to change my ISO, for instance, will definitely make life in the field a little bit more difficult. Another thing that I will find difficult to use with the R7 is the layout of the rear buttons. You all know that with the R5, for instance, I love using double back button autofocus because with the new autofocusing systems, having one button for eye tracking and one button for the normal spot autofocus is very important. Now with the new design, the AF on button is very far over to the left, very close to that wheel, and the star button is very far over to the right, actually almost on the edge of the camera. So it's not going to be as easy anymore. Could just shift your thumb around and press the different buttons. It will actually be kind of probably hard to actually press the star button. Then we have that new interesting dial on off video at the top where the ISO wheel should have been. Personally, I would have preferred to see that wheel on the left hand side and have that ISO wheel, but I'm not opposed to how they've done it with that switch. It actually seems like a good solution. Hopefully it's tight enough that you don't actually turn off the camera when you just want to switch from video back to photo. When it comes to the weather sealing, the R7 seems to be slightly weather sealed, but not as well weather sealed as an R3, for instance. What do you think about the new design? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you find it problematic to use if you have an R5 now, or do you think you'll get used to it very easily? Let me know down there in the comments. The most disappointing part, or the ugly part for me about the R7, is the EVF and the rear screen. I can already see a big difference in the EVF from the R6 to the R5, with the R6 just looking a little bit more pixelated and like a computer screen, whereas the R5 and the R3 and like a Sony A1 for instance give me a beautiful clear picture in the EVF. Now the R7 on the other hand will have a viewfinder with even less resolution than the R6, so while that probably makes sense in this price segment, this is definitely something I'm very disappointed in because I don't expect the viewfinder experience to be that great. At the very least, I was hoping to see a similar viewfinder to the R6, but I guess at this price point this might have not been possible, but it's definitely something that will lessen my experience with the camera in the field. When it comes to the EVF, I would also definitely expect to see some blackout and some lag. So this will be something that people will have to get used to that come from a DSLR camera, but hopefully it's not too bad and will be manageable in the field. Let's talk about video because I feel like this is where the R7 really shines and actually surprised me. And interestingly, a lot of you guys always say that they would prefer to have a camera with good photo features and no video features. But if anything, this camera proves that it's probably going to be the other way around. Great video going forward with some decent photo features because video is just becoming so important. Because the R7, for instance, shoots 4K downsampled from 7K with no 29:59 time limit and shoots apparently up to like about an hour in that downsampled format before overheating. So that's great news. That sounds like great quality files up to 4K 30 frames per second. It does shoot 4K 60 frames per second also with no crop, which is great. But at the same time, it seems like that mode is not downsampled anymore. So the image quality will be a lot worse. The files will just look a lot softer. So still usable, but not as good. And then 120 frames per second we only get in full HD 1080p, and that's apparently also pretty soft, so I wouldn't expect any miracles there, but getting fantastic quality 4K 30 for a long period of time without a time limit is definitely more than I would have expected. And it's also not cropped, which is fantastic. What I'm really curious about is to see what happens when you switch the button at the top to video. Will it keep your photo settings and would start filming in the photo settings, or can you actually have dedicated video settings? So if I'm in manual mode and I flick the switch to video, will it switch to like video manual mode, or will it just keep my same settings in manual mode? Hopefully it switches over and we have photo settings and video settings, but I'll probably expect to have the same settings. That means if you switch to video, you then quickly have to change all your settings like shutter speed, ISO, etc., which can be a little bit annoying, but I expect that to be the case. But I would love to be pleasantly surprised and have actually photo and dedicated video settings. I'm also curious to see what happens if I press the red record button on top. Will it record in a certain setting that I can customize like the R5 and the R3? or will it record in some sort of weird automatic mode like the R6? What about you guys? Are you loving to have hybrid cameras with good video and good photos? Or are you still part of the fraction that says, give me photo only, I don't care about videos? Let me know in the comments. All in all, a very interesting camera with some great features and some disappointing features, but I definitely have ordered one to take out into the field and share all my thoughts with you, because I feel like for many of you guys, this will be a fantastic entry level into the mirrorless market. And with lenses like the 100-500 and the f11 800mm lens, it will actually offer some fantastic birding combos. So I'm looking forward to using the new camera in the field, trying to get used to the new layout. And what do you think? Do you love the camera? Are you excited? Are you disappointed? Let me know in the comments. I think when you look at the camera as an entry level into the mirrorless market, it's an amazing camera with great specs, but it's also a slightly disappointing camera if you look at it as a second body for an R5 or an R6, mainly due to the small buffer, the low resolution EVF, and the new layout. At the same time, I think when it comes to speed and autofocus, these two cameras are truly unrivaled in their market segment. Nothing at that price point has an even remotely close autofocusing capability. So in that regard, very well done, Canon. I was looking for some other news this week and I couldn't find much actually. The big talk was definitely the R7 and R10, but I did see that the Nikon Z9 from B&H Photo Video is now shipping when you ordered on October 30th last year. So it's still a lot of pre-orders to be fulfilled, and if you want to get a Z9 quicker, I would highly recommend that you call up some smaller stores, because they will usually be able to give you your cameras much quicker. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up the early bird photo news for this week. I really appreciate all of you sending me those super thanks, and I would also love to connect with more on you on social media. So make sure to check out my Twitter and Instagram down there in the description. Also send me your account so I can follow you back. I would also really appreciate a thumbs up for the video and would love to hear your thoughts about the upcoming cameras down there in the comments. Are you gonna get one? Have you pre-ordered one? I'm definitely looking forward to using mine in the field and sharing my experiences with you. So until then, make sure to subscribe to the channel and I will see you guys very soon. Bye.